Christmas Eve dinners in my family have always been loud, too loud sometimes. The clinking of cutlery, the overlapping conversations, the bursts of laughter from one corner of the table, and the smell of roasted turkey filling the air. It was the one time of year we all came together, even if some of us were only pretending to enjoy each other's company. That night I was seated near the middle of the table, between my younger cousin and my aunt, trying to keep a polite smile on my face while my mind wandered to work deadlines and the rent payment coming up in a few days. I didn't notice my grandfather walk in at first. I just felt the shift in the room. The kind of silence that's not really silence, more like a pause in the air, when everyone realizes someone important has entered. Grandpa James was the kind of man you noticed, even in his late 70s. Tall, still broad, shouldered from a lifetime of farm work, with eyes that could see straight through your excuses. He had that same half-smile he always wore when he saw me, the one that made me feel like I was 10 years old again, and he was about to slip me a $5 bill for being a good kid. He greeted everyone around the table with hugs, pats on the shoulder, and a few sarcastic comments that made people chuckle. Then he took his seat directly across from me. I remember the warmth in his eyes as he looked at me, the way he leaned forward just slightly, like he'd been waiting for this moment all night. "So, Daniel," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter, "how's the house I gave you 2 years ago?" I froze. My fork was halfway to my mouth, and for a second I thought I'd misheard him. "What house?" I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Grandpa's smile faltered, just a fraction. "The house?" he repeated slowly, as though I was playing some kind of joke. "The one I signed over to you in 2021. You've been living there, haven't you?" My chest tightened. I set the fork down, feeling every pair of eyes at the table lock onto me. "I never received any house," I said, my words dragging in the silence. "I don't even know what you're talking about. That's when it happened." Grandpa's eyes left mine, turning slowly, to my parents, who were seated 2 chairs to his right, their faces drained of color so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. My mother's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. My father stared down at his plate, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch. The room went dead quiet. The laughter from a few seconds ago was gone, replaced by an almost tangible heaviness in the air. Even my little cousins had stopped chewing. Somewhere, a fork clinked against a plate, but no one dared to speak. In that moment, I knew, without knowing the details, that something was very, very wrong. My name's Daniel Carter. I'm 31 years old, born and raised in a small town where everybody knows your business, whether you want them to or not. Growing up, I wasn't exactly the golden child of the family. My parents weren't unkind, not in the way some parents can be, but they were distant. Dad worked long hours, always too tired to talk when he got home. Mom was busy with her own world, church events, charity committees, book clubs, all the things that made her look good in front of others. But Grandpa James, he was different. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to look someone in the eyes when I shook their hand. Every summer, I'd spend a few weeks at his old farmhouse, waking up to the smell of coffee and bacon, working in the garden, listening to his stories about the old days. He had this way of making me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just another background character in my own family. The last few years hadn't been easy. I'd been working 2 jobs, one at the hardware store during the day, another bartending at night, just to keep up with bills. Rent was eating up more than half my income, and saving for anything beyond the next month was almost impossible. I'd never complained to Grandpa about it, though. He had enough to worry about with his own health and the upkeep of his land. Which is why, sitting there at that dinner table, I couldn't wrap my head around his question. A house, given to me 2 years ago, it didn't make sense. My parents' pale faces were the only answer I needed to know that whatever the truth was, I wasn't going to like it. Grandpa's voice cut through the silence, calm but sharper now. "Daniel, you're telling me you never moved into the place I bought for you. I've never even seen it." I said, my voice steady, though my hands were starting to shake under the table. "If you gave me a house, I had no idea." My mother finally looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe this isn't the right time to talk about." Grandpa's hand slammed down on the table, not hard enough to knock over glasses, but enough to make everyone jump. "If not now, then when?" he demanded. "I gave my grandson a home, a place to start his life, and you're telling me he knows nothing about it." My father still wouldn't look at me. His jaw was locked, like he was holding back words that might burn the room down if he let them out. I felt the air shift again, like we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Somewhere deep inside, an old suspicion began to grow, that maybe the people you're supposed to trust most are the ones who can hurt you the worst. And right there in the middle of that Christmas Eve dinner, I decided I wasn't going to leave that table without answers. The turkey on my plate had gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to take another bite. All my focus was locked on the two people who had raised me, now sitting like statues under my grandfather's stare. Around us, the room seemed to shrink. My cousins, aunts, and uncles had gone completely silent. Even the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt louder, ticking like a countdown to something inevitable. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His voice dropped to that quiet, controlled tone I'd only heard a few times in my life, the tone that meant he was deadly serious. "I paid cash for that place. It's in the same town, not 20 minutes from here. I gave the papers to your father and told him to pass them on to you. That was in December 2 years ago." 2 years ago, I tried to think back. That winter had been brutal, snow piling up on the roads, me working overtime just to afford heating. I'd been living in that cramped, damp apartment where the ceiling leaked every time it rained. And all that time my house, was sitting somewhere waiting for me. I turned to my parents, my voice low but sharp. "Is this true?" My father shifted in his seat but didn't answer. My mother reached for her glass of wine, took a long sip, and set it down without meeting my eyes. "Mom, Dad, answer me." My mother sighed, the sound heavy, like she was already exhausted by the conversation. "Daniel, things were complicated. Complicated. I laughed once, but it wasn't a happy sound. You had the deed to a house meant for me, and you didn't think I needed to know. You didn't think I deserved to know. Lower your voice," my father muttered, still staring at his plate. Grandpa's fist came down on the table again, harder this time. "Don't you dare tell him to lower his voice. You've kept something from him that could have changed his life. I trusted you." His voice cracked slightly on those last words, and somehow that hit harder than his anger. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she pushed her hair back. We needed the money more than he needed the house. We thought you sold it." My voice was rising now, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. "You actually sold it." No one answered, but I didn't need them to. My mother's downcast eyes, my father's rigid posture, it was all the confirmation I needed. The pit in my stomach turned into something else, a slow, burning anger. Not the kind that explodes all at once, but the kind that seeps into your bones, that tells you this isn't over. I glanced at Grandpa. His face was a storm, hurt, betrayal, disbelief. But when his eyes met mine, I saw something else too, resolve. Whatever happened next, I knew I wasn't going to be standing alone. When dinner finally broke up, it wasn't with the usual warmth and laughter of a family holiday. No one lingered around the table for coffee and dessert. Conversations were clipped. Eyes avoided each other, and even the kids seemed to sense something ugly had settled into the room. Plates were cleared in near silence. Chairs scraped against the hardwood, each sound sharper than it needed to be. I stood in the living room, pretending to look at the ornaments on the Christmas tree, while my mind was racing. My parents had drifted toward the kitchen, speaking in low voices. Grandpa stayed planted in his chair, his cane resting against the table leg, his eyes following them like a hawk watching prey. Finally, he looked at me. "Come on," he said, his voice steady but grim. We walked together toward the kitchen. My mother turned, her face tightening. "James, this isn't. This is exactly the time." Grandpa interrupted. "You had no right to sell something that wasn't yours to sell." My father stepped forward then, finally meeting his gaze. We were in debt. We had bills piling up. That house was just sitting there, that house. Grandpa cut in, his voice rising for the first time, was a gift to my grandson. It was a chance for him to stop killing himself working 2 jobs just to survive, and you took it from him. I could feel my pulse in my temples. "You could have asked me," I said, my voice shaking more from anger than anything else. "If you needed help, if you were in trouble, I would have tried, but you didn't even give me the choice. You just decided my future wasn't worth as much as your comfort." Mom's eyes were wet now, but she still wouldn't look at me. "It wasn't about comfort," she whispered. "It was about keeping this family afloat." "What family?" I shot back. "The one where we pretend to care about each other once a year over a dinner table, but steal from each other the moment it's convenient." The words hit her like a slap. Dad's jaw worked, but no reply came. Grandpa stepped between us, leaning on his cane. "Daniel," he said, softer now, "let me handle this." Then he turned to them, and his voice hardened again. "Tomorrow, you're going to show me exactly where that money went. Every receipt, every bill, every account, and then you're going to fix this, one way or another." Dad scoffed. "You can't just—" "I can." Grandpa snapped. "And I will." The silence that followed was so thick it felt like the air had weight. Finally, Grandpa nodded toward the door. "Daniel, go home. I'll call you in the morning." But as I walked out into the freezing December night, my breath clouding in the air, I knew this wasn't just going to be a talk about receipts. I'd seen the look in his eyes. My grandfather wasn't just angry. He was planning something, and so was I. The phone rang early the next morning, dragging me out of a restless sleep. I'd barely closed my eyes the night before. My head was full of replayed conversations, imagined arguments, and what-ifs that gnawed at me like a slow drip of poison. I didn't even check the caller ID. I already knew it was Grandpa. "Come over," he said without preamble. "We need to talk, just you and me." 20 minutes later, I was pulling into his driveway. The sun was still low, casting long shadows over the frost-covered yard. The old farmhouse looked the same as it had since I was a kid: weathered wood, chipped paint, the porch swing that creaked in the wind. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. Coffee, bacon, and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon rolls. It was the smell of safety, of every good memory I had growing up. Grandpa was at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between us. He didn't waste time on small talk. "I went by your parents' place last night after you left," he said, his eyes locking on mine. "They admitted everything. The house was in your name on the paperwork, but they forged your signature, sold it, and pocketed the money. I don't even know how they slept after that." My stomach twisted. I thought I'd prepared myself to hear the worst, but it still landed like a punch to the gut. "They said they used it to pay off debts," he continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "But I saw the statements. Sure, a few bills got paid. The rest, new furniture, vacations, a second car. They took your chance at stability and turned it into a shopping spree." I clenched my fists under the table. My mind flashed back to nights when I'd come home from bartending at 3 a.m., too tired to even take off my shoes before collapsing on the couch. Nights when the landlord would text me about rent being late, and I'd have to choose between paying him or keeping the lights on. And all that time they could have changed everything with a phone call. You've got two options, Grandpa said, leaning forward. We can take the legal route, lawyers, court, drag it all into the light. Or we do this my way. I raised an eyebrow. And what's your way? He smiled then, but it wasn't the warm, grandparent smile I'd known all my life. This one was cold, deliberate. We make sure they regret it every single day. We take back more than they ever took from you, and we do it so clean, they won't see it coming until it's too late. I stared at him for a moment. The idea of revenge had been simmering in my mind since last night, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. I'm listening, I said. Grandpa poured himself another coffee, his movements slow, controlled. First, we're going to make them think the family is turning against them, subtle at first. Then, we're going to make them wish they'd never touched that house. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, not because I was afraid, but because I knew this was the beginning of something big. And I wasn't backing down. I sat there at Grandpa's kitchen table, staring into the dark swirl of coffee in my mug, and the memories started to pour in like an old film reel I didn't want to watch but couldn't turn off. I thought back to the winter of 2021, the same winter, apparently, that my parents were selling the house I didn't even know existed. My apartment had been a dump, but it was all I could afford. The windows were so drafty that ice would form on the inside of the glass some mornings. I used to stuff old towels under the frames just to keep the cold from seeping in. Some nights, I'd sleep in 2 hoodies and a beanie just to keep from freezing. I remembered the exact night I'd called my parents to tell them my rent had gone up again. I wasn't asking for money, I never asked for money, but I was venting, hoping for a little sympathy. My mom had said, "You'll figure it out, Daniel. You always do." My dad had been silent the whole call, the faint sound of a TV in the background. I figured they just didn't care much about my struggles. Now, knowing what I knew, that silence felt like a confession they'd never had to say out loud. There was another memory, a summer night not long after that. I'd been invited to a friend's backyard barbecue, and on the way there, my old car had broken down. Transmission shot. I had to leave it in the shop for weeks, taking the bus to both jobs. When I mentioned it to my parents, Mom had sighed and said, "Maybe you should think about getting a more reliable vehicle." I almost laughed at the time, thinking, sure, let me just pull 10 grand out of thin air. Meanwhile, they had just banked more money from selling that house than I'd make in years of working myself to the bone. The anger that had been simmering since last night began to feel heavier, more deliberate. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft dressed up in the thin disguise of family business. Grandpa must have seen it in my face because he reached across the table, his big hand closing over mine. "I know it hurts," he said quietly, "but I also know you. You're not going to roll over and let them get away with it. No," I said, my voice low but steady. "I'm not. That's my boy," he said with a slow nod. "Now, here's what we're going to do. But before we start, you need to understand, once we set this in motion, there's no going back." I didn't hesitate. "I'm in." He leaned back, a gleam in his eye that reminded me of a fox who'd just spotted a chicken coop. "Good. We'll start small. First, we make them feel the walls closing in. We control the story in the family. Then we cut them off from the people they think will protect them. And after that..." He paused, sipping his coffee. "After that, they lose more than just a house." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew, and for the first time since last night's dinner, I felt something close to relief. Not because this was going to be easy, but because it was going to be right. Grandpa's plan didn't start with lawyers, threats, or public shouting matches. It started with whispers. The very next day, he made a few phone calls. Not to my parents. Oh no, he was smarter than that. He called my Aunt Linda first, the one who'd never gotten along with my mother. They'd had decades of polite but icy holiday dinners, and Grandpa knew exactly which strings to pull. I was sitting in his living room, pretending to scroll through my phone, but really, I was hanging on to every word of his side of the conversation. "I'm just so disappointed," he said, his voice low, heavy with regret. "You think you know your own blood, and then they do something like this to their own son." He let the sentence trail off, like the details were too painful to say out loud. That silence was bait, and Aunt Linda took it. I could hear her faint voice crackling on the other end, asking what happened, pressing him for details. Grandpa sighed, the sound of a man too wounded to want to gossip, which, of course, made her want to know even more. "It's not my place to say over the phone," he murmured, "but if you hear anything, you didn't hear it from me." He hung up and smiled faintly. "And now," he said, "we wait. She'll call 3 people before dinner tonight." It wasn't about humiliating my parents outright, not yet. This was about building a storm cloud over their heads, letting the family feel that something was wrong. And sure enough, by the end of the week, I started getting texts from cousins I hadn't heard from in months. "Is everything okay between you and your folks? I heard something happened at Christmas. What's going on?" Meanwhile, Grandpa was making his second move. He invited my parents over for coffee the following Sunday, just like nothing had happened. But I was there too, sitting in the armchair by the fireplace when they walked in. Mom's eyes darted to me immediately, cautious, maybe even a little scared. Dad kept his face neutral, though his stiff shoulders gave him away. Grandpa poured coffee, made small talk about the weather, about the new year coming. Then, without warning, he slid a manila envelope across the table toward them. "What's this?" Dad asked. "Your debt," Grandpa said plainly. "Every cent you owe me, every loan you took that you forgot to pay back. Dates, amounts, and my records of them. You have 2 weeks to make this right." Dad bristled. "That wasn't a loan, don't." Grandpa cut him off. "You sold something that didn't belong to you. This is me being generous. After 2 weeks, I take it public." Mom's hand was trembling so badly she had to set her cup down. "You wouldn't," she said, her voice barely audible. "Try me," Grandpa said. I watched the scene quietly, my anger burning low and steady now. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control. For the first time in my life, I saw my parents completely powerless. And it wasn't just satisfying, it was addictive. When they left, Grandpa turned to me. "That was just the first squeeze. The next part is yours, my part." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with a calculating glint. "Time for you to take something they value, something they never thought they'd lose." I knew exactly what Grandpa meant, and it wasn't about taking a physical object. It was about taking away the thing my parents had always held onto the tightest, their reputation. My parents had built their whole lives around being seen as the respectable couple in town. They were the ones hosting charity dinners, front row at church, smiling in every community event photo. My mother especially thrived on being admired, the whispered compliments about her perfect family, the nods of approval from other parents. To her, perception wasn't just important, it was everything. So I started where it would hurt most. I called my mother's best friend, Mrs. Caldwell. She was the unofficial gatekeeper of the town's social circles, the woman who knew everything about everyone, and could make or break someone's standing with just a few pointed remarks at the right. Luncheon, I didn't come at her directly. Instead, I played it carefully. "I'm sure you've heard something about Christmas Eve," I said casually over the phone, like I wasn't bothered. "It's fine, really, family business. Just surprising to learn your parents have been keeping big secrets from you." Her voice sharpened immediately. "Secrets? What kind of secrets?" I hesitated, the perfect hesitation, just long enough to make her push harder. Then I let a little slip. "Well, let's just say a certain house my grandfather gave me never quite made it into my hands. I'll leave it there." Of course, I knew she wouldn't leave it there. Within days, I heard it circling back to me in the form of concerned. calls from other people, old teachers, church members, even my father's golf buddies. My parents had become the quiet talk of the town, and they knew exactly who started it. When I showed up to church that Sunday, they were already there. Mom's smile was tight, her eyes cold. Dad wouldn't even look at me, but I didn't care because for once, I wasn't the one walking into a room with my head down. That afternoon, Grandpa called me over again. He was sitting at his desk, a spread of papers in front of him. "You did good," he said without looking up. "Now it's time to hit them where it stings financially." I sat down. "What's next?" He slid a set of property tax documents toward me. "They still own the lake cabin your father inherited from my side of the family. It's in both their names, but guess whose name isn't on the loan they took against it?" I skimmed the papers, my pulse quickening. So we call in the loan," he said with a slow smile. "Legally, I can, and when they can't pay it, the cabin goes up for auction. Unless, of course, you buy it first." The thought hit me like a rush of adrenaline. That cabin had been their pride for years. Summers with friends, barbecues, Instagram posts about family getaways. Losing it would be more than a financial blow. It would be a wound to their identity. I leaned back, a grin spreading across my face. "Let's take it." 2 weeks later, the first letter went out. It was short, formal, and devastatingly clear. The outstanding loan on the cabin was being called and a payment in full required within 30 days. I imagined the moment they opened it. My mother's hand frozen halfway to her coffee cup. My father's jaw tightening, the heat creeping up his neck. The realization that the bank wouldn't wait, that they couldn't simply shuffle the numbers around and make it disappear. But this wasn't just about a loan. This was about the slow squeeze, watching them scramble while the deadline crept closer. I didn't have to imagine for long. A week later, I got a text from my mother, "We need to talk." I let it sit unread for a full day before answering with, "I'm busy." When I finally agreed to meet, it was in the most public place I could think of. The small cafe on Main Street. The one with windows wide open to passing foot traffic. They arrived together, but I could tell they hadn't been speaking in the car. Dad's lips were pressed tight. Mom's eyes darted around, checking who might see us. "What's this about the cabin?" Dad started, voice low but sharp. I sipped my coffee. "It's about debts. Debts you can't pay. You can't do this," Mom hissed. "That cabin has been in the family for—" "No." I cut in, keeping my voice calm. "It's been in Grandpa's family. You just got to use it for a while. Now it's time it goes back to someone who won't lie and steal to keep it." Her face went pale, the same way it had on Christmas Eve. But this time, there was no pretending she didn't know exactly what I meant. By the time the 30 days passed, they hadn't been able to raise the money. The cabin went into foreclosure, and sure enough, it was listed for auction. Grandpa and I were there in the front row, my heart pounding as the bids went up. When the final number was called, it was ours. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. A week later, I posted a photo, me, standing on the cabin's deck, the lake glittering behind me. The caption was simple, "Finally home." The comments rolled in, friends congratulating me, neighbors curious how I'd managed it, a few subtle digs from people who clearly knew the backstory. My parents didn't comment, they didn't even call. But I heard from plenty of others how they'd stopped showing up to parties, how they avoided certain stores, how Mom's little circle of admirers had quietly moved on to fresher gossip. Reputation gone, cabin gone, and all I had to do was give them the same thing they'd given me for years, nothing. I didn't think I'd see them again so soon, but 3 months later, fate, or maybe God's sense of humor, brought us together in the most unexpected place. It was the annual town fundraiser, the one where everyone dressed up, bid on silent auction items, and pretended they didn't care about who won what. I'd gone because Grandpa insisted, "We can't hide from life, son." He'd said, and honestly, I wanted to see who'd have the nerve to talk to me now. The room was full of small town politics, forced smiles, and clinking glasses, and then I spotted them. My parents, Mom in a too bright dress, clinging to Dad's arm like a lifeline. Their eyes swept the crowd, skipping right over me until Grandpa stepped forward to greet the mayor. And suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. They froze. I could feel the weight of their stares across the room. I could have ignored them, walked away. But no, they'd taught me too well. So I waited until the big-ticket auction item came up, a weekend stay at a luxury lake front villa. Everyone knew it belonged to the same real estate group that now managed my cabin. The bidding started, and I raised my hand. My parents exchanged a look. They wanted it too. I could see it in their eyes. That villa was the last piece of social currency they could flash around to their friends, proof they weren't completely out of the loop. The bidding war was brutal, back and forth, higher and higher. Each number that left my lips was a dagger, not because I was spending recklessly, but because they knew I could afford to. Finally, the auctioneer called my number, and the room erupted in polite applause. I didn't even look at them as I signed the slip. But as I passed their table on the way back to mine, I leaned just enough for them to hear. Some gifts actually make it to the person they're meant for. Their faces, a mix of humiliation, rage, and something else, fear, told me everything. That was the night I knew they were done in this town. The whispers had already started before dessert was served. From that point on, they became ghosts in their own community. No more invites, no more small favors from old friends. They'd been quietly exiled, and they knew it. And I didn't have to lift another finger. By the following Christmas Eve, everything felt different. The town's energy had shifted. People no longer asked about my parents, and if they did, it was only in passing, like you might ask about a house that burned down years ago. My life was quieter, but not empty. Grandpa and I had turned our evenings into small rituals, chess games, fishing trips, long talks over coffee that stretched into the night. That night, Grandpa invited a few close friends over. The living room smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the polished wood floors. For the first time in years, the air felt light. Halfway through dinner, Grandpa cleared his throat and raised his glass. To truth, he said, locking eyes with me. I raised mine in return, to truth. We didn't speak about that Christmas the year before. We didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was shared understanding. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about them. My parents. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering where they were, if they'd learned anything. Other times, the thought came and went like a shadow. Then, just before midnight, the phone rang. The old landline on the wall, the one Grandpa refused to replace, let out its shrill call. Grandpa looked at me, then picked it up. His expression didn't change as he listened. He simply said, "Hold on," and handed me the receiver. It was my mother's voice, hollow, stripped of all the sharp edges it once had. "We were selling the house," she said quietly. I didn't answer. "We thought you should know." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because life has a way of tying its own loose ends. That house, the one they'd stolen from me, was now slipping through their fingers. I didn't gloat. I didn't curse. I just said Merry Christmas and hung up. That night, as the snow began to fall outside, I realized something important. Revenge hadn't been about destroying them. It had been about reclaiming myself, my name, my place, my truth. And I had all of that now. There's a strange kind of peace that comes after you take back what's yours. But it's not the loud, triumphant peace you see in movies. It's quieter, more subtle, like the calm that follows a storm when you're left standing in the wreckage, knowing you survived because you refused to give up. I thought about all those years of struggle, the cold apartments, the endless shifts, the silent phone calls, the heavy loneliness that settled in your chest when you realized the people who should love you most have turned their backs, And I understood then that revenge wasn't just about making them pay. It was about healing myself. I'm not proud of every choice I made. Some nights I wrestled with the bitterness that threatened to consume me. But every time I looked at that cabin by the lake, every time I sat with Grandpa and felt that quiet strength between us, I knew I was reclaiming my story. Not as their son, not as the forgotten one, but as Daniel Carter, the man who took back his life, piece by piece, and didn't let anyone steal his future again. So if you're listening and you've ever been betrayed by the people you loved, I want you to know this. You don't have to stay broken. You don't have to be their victim. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't getting revenge. It's finding the courage to stand up and say, "This is my life now." And when you do, everything changes. That's the story of how one Christmas Eve started a reckoning, and how I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the strength to fight back and claim what's rightfully yours. Merry Christmas.